What's up, Gear Mortals? Trey Xavier here. Today, we're going to be doing a very simple comparison between two very complex objects, the brand new Pod Go and the HX Stomp from line 6. A lot of people want to know, what's the difference between the two of them? Which one is right for me? Which one should I buy? And today I'm going to hopefully give you the answer for that question in as little time as possible and as straightforward as a way as I possibly can. So let's get right on into it. Just a quick note, I'm not going to be doing any playing in this video. This is not a demonstration of the sounds. There are plenty of those out there. They sound identical. So all I'm going to do today is compare the different features of them so that you can decide which one is right for you. Let's start with the obvious stuff and work our way towards the more kind of complex, nuanced differences between the two units. As you can see, just from looking at them, there is an obvious size difference. I estimate that you could fit about 4 HX Stomps in the same footprint as the Pod Go. That's not necessarily an upside or a downside. I like the HX Stomp because it's small, but I also have it tucked away in my rack, and I never have to worry about how many foot switches there are or whether or not there is an expression/wah pedal. So, of course, the Pod Go is definitely more of a floorboard. It's got more options. It's got 2.5 times as many buttons. We've got 8 little switches on here for your footsies, and there's only 3 on the HX Stomp. So if you need a lot more options on the fly, of course the Pod Go is going to be the jam. The Pod Go has the expression pedal built right in. The HX Stomp has an input for an expression pedal, so if you have a separate one, you can still use it with it, but the Pod Go comes with it right on there, and you can, as far as I understand it, connect it to almost just about any parameter and control the wild stuff. I mean, you could control like the amount of mix on a delay or the amount of distortion on a fuzz pedal or whatever, pretty much anything. And that is wild to me. There's a bit of a price difference. You would think the bigger one would be more expensive, but that is not the case. The HX Stomp is $649 brand new. The Pod Go is $449 brand new. So that's a $200 difference between the two. Why is that? Why is the big boy, the larger piece of hardware, less expensive than this little one? Well, there's more processing power in the HX Stomp. The Pod Go is meant to be very simple in comparison to the full-on Helix stuff. The Pod, once again, not a Helix. It's got all the Helix sounds in it with some small exceptions that I'll go over. But all of the sounds that are in the HX Stomp, aside from those ones that I'm going to mention, are all in the Pod Go. It's the same sounds, same amps, same drive pedals, same delay pedals, all everything that's in here you could get in here. You can load your own IR sounds, your own cab sims into the Pod Go, just like in the HX Stomp or any of the Helix family. In terms of sound quality, there's going to be no difference between these two. The tones that you can get out of one or the other are going to be identical, with the sole limitation of the ways in which you can set up the signal chains. So I'm going to go into that in a second, but essentially you can get a few more blocks out of the Pod Go, but the flexibility in how you arrange them and what you can do with those blocks is a little bit less than the HX Stomp. The Pod Go does not have parallel routing of any kind. The HX Stomp, you can make a parallel signal chain so that you can do stuff like, for example, my favorite thing to do with the bass, which is the split and grit, where you take the signal and split it into a high and a low and you process them separately. You can't do that in the Pod Go. So if that's something that you really need, especially if you're a bass player or if you want to do wild signal routing like that, that's not that wild, really. Having a parallel signal chain is not that crazy. But if that's something that you need, the HX Stomp is where it's at. The Pod Go can't do it, but it's also going to give you a few more effects blocks than the HX Stomp, which currently you can only have 6 effects blocks going at one time. The Pod Go, you can have more than that, but 4 of them are always going to be the same type of thing. On the Pod Go, the amp, the cab block, the wah and volume pedal, and the EQ always have to be those things. Now you can change what specific things those are. For example, you can pick whatever amp you want for the amp block, and you can put either your own cab IR sounds that you upload or any of the stock cab sim sounds that are in there, but it always has to be that. you can also move them wherever in the signal chain you want. For example, if you want to take the amp and put it at the end for some reason, or you want to take, you want to have your delay going into the reverb, or the reverb going into the delay, or whatever. You can move them around however you like, both using the front panel editor or the PodGo Edit, which is the PC Mac editor that I'm going to show you a little bit of in a minute. The HX Stomp also has its own editor, HX Edit. That one's a lot closer to the other Helix ones. PodGo Edit is pretty drastically different, I think, from these, but that's, of course, the easiest way to do it. But when you're doing it on the fly, you're at the gig, you don't have a computer handy, you can always do that on the front panel. And I actually found that to be easier to do and a lot simpler on the PodGo. And that fits the PodGo's whole MO. It's really not meant to be incredibly powerful. It's meant to be very simple and also to sound really great. But honestly, like, I found it to be basically close to almost as powerful as a lot of the Helix products, like any of them, the rack, the floorboard. It's got a lot of stuff. It's just certain specific limitations that you have to watch out for. The way that it's laid out is just meant to be simple as hell. You can see everything. It's all in one little line. It's not that fancy. Just really having a nice big layout, really being able to see everything, having more knobs to work with. That's why I think they called it Pod rather than being part of the Helix family. Like, the Pod was super, super simple. Oh, look, I just happen to have one right here. There's not a lot of mystery to it. It has knobs like traditional amps. It has one knob that does effects, like one knob that you can choose the effect, and then one knob to tweak the effect. And regardless of whether or not you liked the Bean, and I spent a lot of time with the Bean, all right, you don't really go here for complex stuff, although at the time it was extremely powerful. So that's why I think the PodGo is called the PodGo and not the Helix Go or the HX Go, even though it has the Helix sounds and effects in there. The HX Stomp has that sort of complexity to it and the power and all of that. The PodGo can sound exactly the same as long as you're not going too wild, but it's more user-friendly for sure. If it's sound quality that you're worried about between these two, don't worry about that. It's literally identical. The only thing that I've found in terms of that is that you can't load 2048 IRs. You can, but they're automatically downgraded to 1024, which, I mean, gun to my head, I could not tell you the difference between the two. I don't really hear it at all, so pretty unlikely that you'd be able to hear it too, but maybe you've got a better ear than I do. I don't know. That's just a consequence of there being slightly less processing power in the PodGo, and the HX Stomp having a lot of processing power, especially considering its size. All of the amp models are the same in both of these, including the two new ones that do your boy's heart real good, which is the Rev red and purple channels. I'm so happy about that. I could cry. They sound great. And you can see in the background here, I have 3 Rev amps, just a gluttonous stack of their cabs. So I am a Rev freak, and I thought it sounded real close. So I'm actually in the process of changing all of my guitar patches to use those too. One of the really big ones for me personally is MIDI integration. Now, the HX Stomp has regular old traditional MIDI in and out. It has the 5-pin MIDI stuff. It's got full MIDI integration, and you can use basically any MIDI device with it. The PodGo only has MIDI over USB. So if you have a rig that's controlled via MIDI over USB, using a laptop, something like that, you can use that to control the PodGo if you like, but if you have something that's typical 5-pin MIDI, you can't use that with this. I kind of think that you're missing the point if you're trying to control this with MIDI, because this is a, put it on the floor and go kind of a unit. You can, of course, use the HX Stomp in that same sort of sense, and a lot of people do, but you can also use it tucked away in your rack as a completely MIDI-controlled, MIDI-switched sound source, and that's how I use it. Actually, I did a whole video around just this topic in particular. You can check that. There's probably a card in one of the corners popping up, or if you just search for the all-in-one rack, on our channel. And really, that's what excited me about it the most. I have also brought just this to a gig and played with guitar into this, into front of house, and that was it, and it worked so good. But I didn't need a ton of different kinds of sounds, so having just the 3 foot switches worked great for me. The Pod Go, on the other hand, is really set up for live performance. You've got more foot switches that you can assign in a plethora of different ways, and if nothing else, just has several different types of modes where you can either be switching between the different patches that you've set up and going between, for example, the different banks. Inside of those banks, you can choose the different patches that you've all got pre-set up. You can also use it in sort of stomp box mode with a push of one button, and you can turn each of the different things in your signal chain on and off, and you can set beforehand which one of these is gonna do what. And they're color-coded so that you'll know, even if you don't remember where you put which one, you'll know which one's which. For example, blue is always gonna be your mod, yellow is your EQ, orange is your reverb, whatever you want, really. And you can easily switch between them in real time by just hitting the mode button. And then a whole dedicated button for tap tempo and tuner. If you hold it down, the tuner comes up. It's quite large and easy to see on this screen, which once again is bigger than that's on the HX Stomp. The HX Stomp is the idea that they're putting as much power and functionality as they can into the smallest unit. So of course there are certain compromises that you have to make on such a small unit, and having a smaller screen is one of them. But on the Pod Go, they weren't so worried about the size that they couldn't put a good sized screen on it. It's still pretty small. It's still much smaller than any of the Helix floor models. It's smaller than the Helix LT, and of course the HX Stomp is the only one that is smaller than it. Let's compare the tuners on the Pod Go and the HX Stomp while I've got the tuner open on here. Okay, that's responding very quickly. It's a nice bright green. We've got 2 different levels of sensitivity. So there's sort of like it's not gonna do it unless I play. It's got like kind of a coarse one and then a super fine one. So you can actually see how close you are on 2 different levels, because you gotta get it in the ballpark and then really dial it in. That's cool. All right, now checking out the tuner on the HX Stomp. This is 2.91 firmware. Looks about the same. The buttons light up when you're in tune. I didn't notice that before. And then there's a couple different types of tuner, okay? Fine, coarse, and strobe. This one has those as well. I did not try it. I really like this coarse and fine one together. That's cool to me. I don't really use strobe tuners in general, so, but if you do, there it is. The main difference with these, of course, just being which one you're gonna be able to see better on stage. This one is a bit smaller, but you know, if your eyes are good, you're all right. I found that the live functionality of the HX Stomp is a bit limited. It's got different modes that you can use. It's got snapshot mode for 3 different snapshots. It's got one that's got the preset up and down for these 2 buttons, and then the tuner on the 3rd one. So if you have them in a certain order and you can just go through them as you like, then that works fine. If you just want to go up and down, maybe you just have a couple. The one that I like the most is the preset specific one, because I only use 3 or maybe 4 sounds in any given set. So I like to just have them all laid out, like rhythm, lead, clean, or whatever, and being able to switch between them like that in real time. You can also have it set up where each button turns on and off a specific effect or whatever. That's more like stomp box mode, but once again, you've got a limited number of foot switches, so that is only really useful if you have 1 or 2 effects specifically that you want to be turning on and off. So you just have to choose more carefully when you're using this. You're gonna have a lot more possibilities in real time with the Pod Go. Both of these can be connected via USB to use them as an interface. That's a kind of a standard feature these days on modelers. If it doesn't have that, I don't know, honestly, if it's worth whatever price you would pay for it, considering pretty much all of them have this, but being able to have an interface that you can use to reamp or record, as well as listening over headphones, that kind of thing, as well as it being a super powerful modeler, is really awesome to me. love the age that we're living in where you can get something like this for this cheap and it does all of that. So if you're considering like using this at home to get all of your amp sounds for like reamping or recording or whatever, either one of those will do that. The only real difference that I noticed in terms of the quality of the build of these two is that the Pod Go has plastic knobs, okay? That's not really that big of a deal if you're not rough with it, but they will probably break faster than the super solid metal knobs that are on the HX Stomp. All of them are buttons as well as knobs. That increases the amount of functionality in the smaller space. So they're really thinking in terms of how can we get the most stuff done in the smallest amount of space, which of course, at any given moment is going to make it a little bit more of a learning curve. If there isn't a dedicated button or switch or knob for every function, you're gonna have to spend a little time with it to learn. But honestly, like, I didn't read the manual almost at all, and I was able to figure out how to do everything on the front panel of the Pod Go completely intuitively. If you're not that tech savvy, it might take you a little bit longer, but I honestly, like, I like to approach things like just put my hands on it, see if I can make it do the thing that I need it to do, and if not, brave the angry forums to find the answers that I needed. And I didn't really have to do that at all with the Pod Go. I mean, it's right in the name, Go. It's super easy to go through and tweak stuff on the fly. Okay, we've got, for example, this amp. You can just go through all the different kinds of amps and try them out. You could be playing them in real time if you like. Try each one as you go or whatever, or you could go down the list like this. There's an option to use just the preamp. If you're using this as just your preamp sounds going into a power amp and a real cab, you can do it like that. That's pretty powerful, but if you don't understand what that means, it doesn't matter. You just leave it alone. Basically, it means that this will have power amp modeling built in, and then you just, you know, push the little knob down to choose the thing. So we can go through the whole signal chain so easily. Like, look at this. Turn it on, turn it off, change it up. Throaty, colorful, conductor, weeper. That's probably like a weeping demon from Ibanez. Okay, volume pedal, turn that on and off, or we can make it gain, pan, stereo width, or just leave it. The effects loop you can turn on and off. Here's one of the pedal slots that we've got here. You can make it any of these different kinds of pedals. They are conveniently color-coded. And once again, these are all the same that are gonna be in the HX Stomp, with these three exceptions that I'm going to have to read off the page because I couldn't remember. It's the Clawthorn Drive, the Tone Sovereign, and the Cosmos Echo are the three pedals that I guess were just too big DSP hogs. They couldn't fit them in here. If those three pedals are ones that you use so much that it's such a big difference, then you definitely are gonna wanna get the HX Stomp over the Pod Go in this case. Everything else is in here. Neither of these units offers Variax connectivity. So if you were hoping to plug in your Variax connector into these and control your Variax with these, it can't be done. But that's one of those things that would have jacked the price of the Pod Go up. Obviously the HX Stomp, there's just not enough room to have something that complex in there. It's probably a lot of cables and stuff, and they're trying to keep this one very small and this one very cheap and simple. So that was right out. The Pod Go, unlike the HX Stomp, which has two inputs, stereo inputs, the Pod Go only has one mono input. So if you are somebody who has to have two inputs for whatever reason, like if you're running a stereo guitar like a Rickenbacker, or like if you, for example, have a guitar that has two outputs, like one for the electric pickups and one for the piezo pickup, then you're not gonna be able to do that at the same time with this. Once again, that's sort of an advanced move, and the Pod Go is meant to be very simple. Let's talk about the I/O differences between these two. They both have expression pedal jacks, so you can use a separate expression pedal. This one, of course, already has a built-in expression pedal, so you could have two total, but this one you're gonna have to bring your own, but it's got a jack for it. They both have USB, of course. Pod Go has a very cool feature, which is the amp out. So you can set that to be a number of different things, but the main idea is that you're able to go straight from here into the front of the amp. If you do that in something and you haven't got it routed properly, then it's possible that you're gonna be double cabbing, that you'll be running a cab sound in here going into the front of the amp, and then that's going out a cab. And if you've ever done that, then you know how like sort of dull and dark the sound becomes, because you know, a cab sound sort of narrows the frequency range, and it rolls off a lot of high end and some low end. It's not a great sound. You probably have maybe done this before and been like, why does it sound so dull? This thing's terrible. Like, but really, you need a separate output if you're going to be doing both at once. So, for example, if you want to send out your cabbed sound to front of house and to your in-ears, you can go out the main outs, and then you also want to run an amp on stage. You can have this go right into the front of that amp, or you could go straight into the power amp of an amp, and that'll go out a cab. Anything, any combination of those is going to work with the Pod Go. You can do that in the HX Stomp, but it doesn't have a dedicated output just for that. They both have dedicated headphone outs so that you can either practice silently, or you can go straight into your in-ear monitoring rig out of that, or something like that. Both units offer stereo effects loops, but the HX Stomp has two separate inputs, whereas the Pod Go has just one combined stereo input, so you'll have to recombine the signal before it comes back into the Pod Go if that's something that you want to do. So that's a little bit more complicated in terms of external hardware that you have to get with adapters and stuff like that. But both of them, the stereo send is one single output that you once again have to split after the signal gets out of the unit, and then do whatever you're going to do to it with external effects, pedals, whatever, and then send it back in. Each one has 128 user cab IR slots so that you can load in your own cab sounds, which is something that's very important to me. I am a big stickler for cab sounds. I think it's almost more important than anything else. So being able to load in that many makes me a very happy boy. I don't think I'd ever need 128 of them, but you know, maybe you're doing some really intensive cover gigs, you need every sound under the sun. If you use more than 128, I'm very curious to know why, but that's a lot. So you can have all of those in there, either one. One very cool feature of both of these is that you don't actually need a separate DI box. You can go direct out from these outs and just go straight to front of house, as long as you have a TRS to XLR cable or adapter, because these only have 1/4 inch outs. There is no XLR out of either of these. Let's take a quick second to compare the editors that are available for PC and Mac. So over here we've got the HX Edit for the HX Stomp. We can see all the patches that I've got over here. I still have a lot of the factory patches in here because I don't really use that many, so I've only got the first like 8 or so. There's a lot of presets in this that are set for different kinds of uses. I don't know if you're the kind of person that uses factory presets at all, but it's really handy for me to have something to start with, to work off of, depending on what I'm going for. For example, we've got ones that are set up for direct, ones that are set up for just using it as an effects module without using amp sounds, ones that are set up for 4-cable method if you're using a physical amp and you want to get it set up that way. And those are really handy to use because if you don't want to sit there and figure out the specific routing, you can go in and just grab one of these and then mess with it, change the effects and change the specific kinds of sounds that are being used, but the routing is set up the way that you want it to be. So that's really easy to use. On the HX Stomp, you can put any block anywhere. You can make any block anything. One big one on the HX Stomp is that you can use 2 different amps and 2 different cab blocks. That's something that you cannot do in the Pod Go. If you have to have a dual amp setup in your signal chain, the Pod Go is not the way to go. I find that that is pretty rare, and I don't know a lot of people who use a dual amp sound. I have occasionally for very specific things, but you could probably go your whole life with never doing that and be all right. The HX Stomp only has 6 available blocks that you can use, so in that sense it is a bit limited, but those blocks can be whatever you want them to be, all of them. Any one of them could be any kind of specific effect. You could have 6 chorus pedals in a row or whatever, as long as the DSP can handle it. You can, of course, have parallel signal chains. If you see, it's that easy to make a parallel signal chain in here. You just grab it and drag it down. You can put anything in any order you like. It's so easy. Love it. Now with the Pod Go, you can still drag effects around. You can put them in different places. You can put pretty much, as far as I can tell, you can put anything anywhere you like to your little heart's content. And once again, you can change the types of effects that you've got, except for the ones that I mentioned. So like I can make this a pitch instead of whatever it was before. You can make it a delay. You can't change the EQ. You can change it to a different kind of EQ. I love me one of these Cali Q graphics, kind of like a Mark series from Mesa Boogie. Love that kind of a thing. And then, you know, it's gonna sound different depending on where you put it in the chain. So you can put it before the amp, after the amp, put it after the cab if you like. That's a very different sound. So still tons of flexibility on the Pod Go, but you can't make a parallel signal chain. You can't just drag it down like you can on the HX. Isn't this one just way more colorful and nicer to look at? I love the power of HX Edit, but Pod Go Edit is just so friendly. Big old colorful pictures. I know that, I mean, what am I, a child? But like, man, sometimes scrolling through menus and stuff on these kinds of things can be so depressing. This is fun. This is way fun for me. And once again, extremely simple. In general, I am much more likely to want to use the HX Edit than to try to edit stuff on the face of the HX Stomp. It's not that it's impossible or really all that hard. It's just way easier in HX Edit, way faster for me, easier to use a mouse than to, you know, scroll around. The Pod Go, it's a bit more of a toss-up. Like, sure, you can use the Pod Go Edit, and it is gonna be faster and a little bit easier, but not that much faster and easier. I can do pretty much everything on the face of this. Once again, really nice to look at, very colorful, big pictures, especially when you're standing there on stage, everybody's waiting, you have to fix something, you don't wanna be going through menus, like trying to remember what's what. It's literally a picture of an amp, okay? Oh, no wonder it sounds weird. The amp's not on. You just push the button to turn the amp on. It's just really, really user-friendly. I think at this point, you have pretty much all the ammunition that you need to make the decision as to whether or not you're gonna get the Pod Go or the HX Stomp. Really, I don't think you can go that wrong with either one. They're just a bit different from each other. They're both very, very powerful. I fell in love with the HX Stomp the instant that I saw it, that I knew that it existed. I have 3 of them in a rack. It's all completely MIDI switched, so I don't actually see the thing all that often because it sits in the rack, but if you need something on stage and you need to be changing stuff in real time, the Pod Go makes much more sense. I had to have the HX Stomp because everything is MIDI switched. If you've got that kind of a setup, then the HX Stomp is where it's at. You can kind of do that with the Pod Go, but it's not really set up for that to be really easy. Everything else about it is set up to be extremely easy and fun to use. For live performance, the Pod Go, in my book, wins. If you're stepping on switches in real time and you have to do it, you know, more of a performance, definitely go with the Pod Go. If you need parallel signal paths, you have to get the HX Stomp. You cannot do that in the Pod Go. So I think for bass players, the HX Stomp actually might be a better buy. You know, it's not gonna make a difference if you don't use split and grit or parallel signal processing. You could just as easily go with the Pod Go for the bass. Honestly, it's gonna be hard to go wrong with either of these. I've used them both extensively. I like them both very much. So like, I don't know you know, I don't know your life, I don't know your gig, I don't know what kind of music you're playing. These will cover pretty much anything, really. You can play any genre under the sun. There's tons and tons and tons of different things in here. Long story short, they're both great. They're a little bit different. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you haven't already, mash that subscribe button, smack the bell to join the notification squad. Leave me a like and drop a comment in the comments section below letting me know if you bought one of these or the other and which one and why. Because I'm really curious to know what it is that you're planning to do with it and why you got one over the other. And I'll see you real soon.